Well, read a statistic a week or two ago that Seattle is the number two city in the US of percentage of workers who work remotely behind Washington, D.C. at a staggering 47%. How many of those have had somebody enter their meetings clothed or unclothed in the background? I have had that happen at my house. It's here. It's here to stay. It may morph over time, but obviously, all of you as employers are faced with how to deal with a remote workforce. Now, obviously, there's a difference between your business challenges and having any part of your workforce working remote and what the legal implications are. Probably your biggest questions are not ones I can answer. Should I bring all of my people back? If not, how many days a week? Who needs to be in the office? How do I integrate the people who are working remotely with the people who are working in the office? Those are all business challenges that we all have faced if you have any folks working remotely, but that's not what I'm going to talk to you about today. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the legal implications and things that you may not have thought about as you are continuing with the remote work that was started due to the COVID pandemic. And kind of the overlay of all of the things I'm going to talk about today is how you apply remote work fairly. And this is something that you need to think about regardless of the individual questions that I may address today or that you may have. And these have been kind of floating around in terms of how remote work may impact or the decisions you have in allowing certain members of your workforce to work remotely if you have a hybrid workforce. Practically speaking, what happens with those workers who are working remotely and those that are in the office? Are there more in-face people? The decision makers are at work, and so those employees who come into work have more opportunities, whether it's promotions, whether it's those projects that are really juicy that can get them more experience, and what impact does that have across your workforce for those that are working remotely, and you might have to spend a little bit more energy getting those same opportunities to the remote workforce. Certain classes, whether it's women, whether it's people in different areas, race, are those impacted differently because they're working remotely? It's not something that is necessarily intuitive or something you think about, but you really need to determine whether or not you need to analyze how your remote workers are being promoted, being paid, being given projects to make sure that those remote workers have the same opportunities and you don't set yourself up for some sort of discrimination claim because some are working remotely and some are not. So what are your legal risks? I've divided it into 4 categories. We'll spend a little bit of time on each. But the top 2 are really what laws apply to your workers. And it's not something that we really thought about before remote work became so popular. Hannah talked a little bit about a couple of the laws that apply to those employees who are living in Seattle. Again, if your company is not located in Seattle, but you have workers that live in Seattle, Seattle labor laws apply. And those of you who have been spending any time sitting and listening to us over the last 10 years know that Seattle has some very particular labor laws that apply, all of which are listed here. So I'm not going to go through them all. You probably heard them. Maybe you haven't paid attention because your office is in Bellevue, but you have a couple workers who live in Seattle, and so now you have to pay attention. So if you have any questions about that and whether these labor laws apply to that particular employee and how to deal with them, just let us know. This is probably the number one risk that companies don't think much about in terms of their employees that are working outside of the state of Washington. And it has become very popular to leave Washington to better climates and smaller towns. Arizona has been popular, Idaho has been popular, California has been popular, and places in different areas of the country. Or you maybe decided that you are excited about the opportunity to expand your recruiting to different parts of the country because you have had trouble finding the particular workers that you want. All that is great. These are opportunities that we haven't seen before, and you can really take advantage of them. But there's things that you need to think about. There are, and not every state treats this differently. I've looked at some state law and whether or not it applies. For example, Florida has said, come live in ours. We're not going to punish businesses who have employees who live in our state. However, not all states apply this idea evenly. So here's some things to think about. You will have to abide by the state employment laws where the employee resides. So that could be laws on non-competes, that could be laws on notices for termination. There's all kinds of things that may apply that you're not used to dealing with here in Washington. California specifically has a lot of employment laws that are very different from here in the state of Washington and are usually more employee friendly. And so we just would caution you, if you have an employee or employees who are moving to or living in California, that you just need to be a little bit careful when you're taking any action related to that employee. Have you registered to do business in Idaho or Utah or Arizona? And do you have a registered agent there if you're a smaller business here in Washington? Not all states require this if a single employee is living in that state, but some do. Probably the most risky is the potential tax liability. And this can be corporate and business activity taxes, sales taxes, different employer withholding taxes that must be paid if you have an employee living in certain states. You might have to register with each state's tax authority. Again, not every state requires this, but if you're starting to have employees that move out of state, these are considerations that you need to take into account when you're setting up and allowing your employees to move out of state. Also might be local licenses and business permits. And this generally may not be true in other parts of the state of Washington, but some states, some cities, some counties want you to register because there's fees involved. And this is a great way for certain municipalities or other government entities to make some money. So that's just something to look at. And again, especially if you want to enforce a non-compete or something else in an employee that lives in another state, you might want to touch base with counsel to make sure that that's lawful activity to take. So the next piece is security and confidentiality. And I'm hopeful that as all of you who went to a remote workforce during COVID took these sorts of things into account. But for those of you who think you maybe need to take a look back at security protocols for your remote workers or haven't really thought about it, it's something to keep in mind. Cybersecurity instances continue to occur. Do you have a group of or a worker who lives in an apartment with roommates? Are they all on their Zoom calls in the living room with their headsets? Is there confidential information being discussed? Have you addressed that with your workforce? Are they printing at home? How do they dispose of confidential documents that they've printed? Or do they have their own devices that they're using? You shouldn't be emailing confidential information to and from a personal account. You shouldn't be texting your clients, or maybe not even fellow employees, depending on what that information is. It's much less secure. So again, hopefully you have already gone down this road, but wanted to bring that up just as something to take a look at if it's been a while since you've looked at those protocols. And finally, wanted to talk about how to discipline and terminate employees who work either fully remotely or in a hybrid capacity. And this has come up a little bit more recently. It's terminating an employee is always difficult, and There are issues that come up for remote employees that may not, if you're in the office and need to go into the office and terminate them that day. But to back up in terms of discipline, how do you track productivity and how do you do it legally? There's been a lot of discussion about productivity tools, whether you're going to count keystrokes. We don't have a comment about that, but do keep in mind that you need to have if you're going to very carefully track productivity, you need to make sure that in your policy somewhere you have the identification that their work, their internet use, their email use is not private and that they should not have an expectation of privacy. It should be explained to them how you're tracking, when you're tracking, so that the privacy issues are addressed. How do you communicate with your remote employees? If they're not there, are you doing it appropriately? I'm sure you've heard all of us over the years say document, 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 and communicate, communicate, communicate. Communicating with your employees and then documenting that communication is the key to defending nearly every type of employment action or claim that we have. So are you doing that? Are you doing that in the same way you do with your employees who are in the office? It shouldn't be any different whether or not, you're emailing more, you're doing things on a Zoom call. Does that change the way you take notes? Does that change the way that you document those conversations? It shouldn't, but, once again, I'll remind you, document, 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 and communicate, communicate, communicate. And the issues that arise when you are working remotely and you are trying to communicate a disciplinary issue or even a termination is, what do you do with Zoom? How do you know there's not somebody else in the room with them listening or recording you? You don't. So what you need to do is to make sure that whatever you're communicating may be listened to then, or maybe recorded. So it is doubly important that in all disciplinary and termination conversations, you have a third person in the Zoom that you have introduced who is on screen so that that employee understands that there is a, as neutral as can be, third party just observing the conversation so that if in fact there's some sort of other person on the other side, you also are protected with your own witness. We never recommend on a Zoom call or a telephone conference that you have anybody on the line who is not identified to the employee. That has its own risks and frankly is not fair to the employee, as you wouldn't want anybody on the employee's end who hasn't been identified as well. So the last point here is, there are different ways to make sure that you get all of the equipment, the security cards, the confidential information, the laptop, the cell phone back from employees. You don't necessarily have to have them come back to the office. It may not be in the best interest of either you or the employee to have them return. Send the FedEx return envelope. Have a conversation while you're doing the termination of how to do that. Make sure you shut everything down remotely. Talk to your IT folks before you have that termination conversation. Most companies are pretty used to this by now, but every once in a while, it's just something you forget because they're not walking out of an office and they have access. So it's really important from a security perspective that you make sure you have thought about how to go about making sure you get all your equipment and confidential information back from the employee when you're doing a termination.